Hi, I'm Captain Jack Springle here at the Saltwater Reg, and we're going to talk round two, jigging and popping. To start with it, we're going to go with jigging out of jigging and popping. Again, jigging has been around for a long time. Mostly it conjures up images of working diamond jigs on the bottom for codfish, but people have been catching tuna on metal for a very, very long time. And any other game fish you happen to be targeting. Again, because we're talking jigging and popping, we're really focusing on very powerful pelagic species, big game, and some of the more tropical species you can travel for. There are techniques like slow pitch that has worked its way down to inshore fishing, and you can micro size and downsize your gear to use jigging and popping for just about any fish. But for all intents and purposes, we're talking big game here. We're talking the extreme version of the sport, so we're going to focus on that end of it. So jigging. I like to equivalent jigging as sight fishing. You don't want to think of jigging as a blind fishing technique. It's brutal on the body in general. If you're going to be working fishing lures through the water column all day blindly by lifting on metal on the end of a stick, it's just going to beat your body up. So think of jigging as sight fishing, and it works in two different ways. Sight fishing conjures up an image of a guy on a platform, poling the bonefish with a fly looking for it. But really it translates to this style of fishing as well. But you're going to be using your sonar as your set of eyes, and possibly a pair of something like image stabilizing binos up above deck to keep an eye out for the life. If we keep it focused here in New England, generally you're looking at either tuna under life, or you're looking at structure for species like wahoo or mahi-mahi. When it comes to tuna, more often than not, tuna, because they're constantly swimming, constantly have this super high calorie drive intake that they have to basically fulfill all day, every day, they're always going to be maximizing their effort to get the most amount of calories they can get in that amount of time. So they're going to be near large food sources. If you're in cooler water up like Cape Cod, pretty good chance that's going to be up near some marine mammals feeding, or where you see some kind of large commercial activity taking place. If you're further offshore, you may find large groups of whales, especially off Rhode Island here. You'll find them on sand eels, or you'll find some kind of commercial operation focusing around squid, or even something like scallops. Somewhere where there's going to be a lot of meat moving through the water column, that's where those fish are going to be. So again, use your eyes ahead of time, use your crew's eyes. Everybody on the boat should be looking. When I'm running a boat and I have a team and we're jigging, I tell my guys, everybody on the boat, you should spot what's going on before I do. I'm running the boat, have your eyes open, be looking around. Once you find that life, once you find that little bit of activity, you're going to get over the top of it, and you're going to start using your sonar, your technology. Maybe you've got a basic conical sonar. Maybe you're fortunate enough to have something like side scan or periscope sonar, live view. There's a lot of different techniques you can use to find these fish, and a lot of fancy equipment out there. But even with just a basic fish finder, maybe you're running a small center console and you've run out to the gully and you're trying to find some bluefin. Understanding what these fish look like, what the arches identify like in the water column, and understanding what the current is doing can have a big impact on how you use sight fishing to jig. So, give you another scenario like that. On my way out there, if I have a couple of lobster pots, especially if there's a high flyer involved, one of the things I'm looking at is where the flagged flyer is, because you got one pot that's anchored to the bottom. The flagged flyer is going to be in the direction the tide is running, even more so than the wind in many cases. So as I'm putting around, I'm looking at whales, I'm finding fish, I'm going to try to position my boat and myself up above drift from wherever I marked that activity, that life, so that as I'm dropping my jigs down into the water column, I can get them into that life, into that fish before I've drifted by it. So that part of the handling and the sight fishing is key. Another awesome feature you can use is something like metered braid. Power Pro Depth Hunter is what I fish. If I'm marking fish in 100 feet of water and they're at 50 feet, I know that my line changes color every 25 feet. So I can drop 2 colors down, and depending on the terminal length of my leader system, compensate for that and work a bait effectively within about a half a color and stay in the strike zone on those fish. So think of jigging as sight fishing. And I always try to tell people it's almost like casting a lure to fish on the surface. You're just doing it straight up and down through the water column. And just like on the surface, maybe they wanted a big stick bait that day. Maybe they want a popper. Maybe they want a spook. Maybe they want it fast. Maybe they want it slow. So having a variety of jigs to pick from will have a huge impact on that. And all these shapes and colors matter. Sometimes having a jig that glows makes all the difference. You can do this at night, especially up here in the Northeast. Yellowfin tuna absolutely crush jigs vertical through the water column at night. And maybe they're on a smaller bait, maybe they're on larger bait that resembles sand eels. You can match the profile of the bait. That will help. Match the color of the bait can help. Sometimes just looking different than what's in the water will help. So don't be afraid to buy a jig that's just outrageous and doesn't just look lifelike. There's a reason for all these colors out there. One of my favorite baits is the shimmer fall. One of the reasons I select this bait is because it allows me to fish it very slow or very fast through the water column. So don't just be a one-trick pony when you're out there. The more you understand lures like shimmer fall, for example, I can drop this to the bottom, I can very passively jig it on the bottom, almost like a traditional jigging technique, or I can institute half turns, slow pitch style, or I can do a very traditional lift, reel, lift, reel, lift, reel, and that jig's basically going to be either walking the dog as I lift or fluttering on the drop through the water column. More often than not, those fish, a large tuna is looking for that one injured bait fish. Again, we're talking about maximizing calories versus energy being burned. So they're going to take in more food than they're burning. They're going to look for that injured fish on the flutter. That's why slow pitching is such an effective technique, and it's a big part of jigging and popping right now, is because it allows that subtle flutter of an injured bait fish. But you will find sometimes, like when tuna get in like a heated up aggressive feeding mode, or mahi if you're on a fly and you want to vertical jig them, you need to be running from them. And one of the most important things is presentation with that. We'll get into that with topwater as well. Presentation is everything. But get up a drift of these fish, drift over the top of them, and try several different lures. If there's 2 or 3 of you on the boat, tie a couple jigs on. If one jig is producing fish, everybody switch over. Having the right arsenal in place allows you to vertical jig effectively. And if you think of vertical jigging as basically sight fishing, it's going to drastically improve your catch rate. With the concept of jigging understood, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the gear. Again, I mentioned it earlier in the first part of this series, you want a shorter length rod. You don't want a long fulcrum. You don't want to have to lift an object at the end of a long stick versus, it's almost like holding a chair out far away by one leg versus holding it against your body. The further away the weight is from your body, the more wear and tear you're doing. So a nice short rod, something really 6 feet or less. I like something in the 5 foot plus range. 5'8" to 6 feet is about where I have my jigging rods. Even as short as 5'4". You still need to be able to clear the gunnel fighting fish, but that's kind of the sweet spot when it comes to it. You want a parabolic rod that's going to bend all the way back into the reel, because this fights straight up and down, and if it's a bluefin or another tuna species, it's down and dirty right away. So having a forgiving rod that has just enough power to put the pressure on the fish is key. And that's where ratings and stuff on the rod comes from. You can't just do the old, let me push it against the ceiling or bend it. You're going to see gram ratings on them, and every jig that you buy will have a gram rating on it. There's a 210 gram jig, which comes out to about 7+ ounces. If you used a rod that was rated for less than 200 grams, you would have a very difficult time imparting an action on this jig. If you use one that's over, you'll still be able to impart action on the jig, but it'll feel a little bit stiffer. You won't get as much of the action. So you want to have a rod that has a jig rating that's at least within the scope and the size jigs you're going to be using. You can work lighter jigs on a heavier rod, but working heavier jigs on a lighter rod is a no-go. It's not very efficient. It's also important that you have the line ratings on there. If you're going to be using 80-pound tests, you don't want to be using something like a 60-pound class rod or a 20-pound class rod. You want to make sure you're matching your strength to that, because when you're jigging fish, you're going to actually have much tighter drag than you would use popping. And one of the reasons for that is when you hook up on these fish, you got to set the hook almost on the action. A lot of times the jig strike will look, and I have some videos here, you'll be lifting, reeling, lifting, reeling, lifting, reeling, and just it stops, or you'll get a miss. I live for that personally. You go again, couple more jigs, bang, it stops. So you need to be able to get that hook set. It's usually 1 or 2 quick pumps, because once the fish is dumping, 0 hook setting. No more hook setting when the fish starts to run. And that's true with popping as well. So work that jig up through the water column. You feel and miss it, just keep that same motion that was getting you hit, bang, you're tight. Now the drag is going to be very tight right away. There's going to be a lot of pressure on these fish very quickly. So it's important that you have the right kind of forgiving setup to allow you to do that. Getting a little deeper into jigs themselves, you'll notice a few things about them. And one of the things you'll notice is that the hook is coming off the top of the jig. An inexperienced person who might not have had the opportunity to learn about this ahead of time, most of us are wired to tie our hook to the end here and have the hook on the backside. But because vertical jigs aren't moving through the water like a lure this way, they're working up through the water column. A game fish isn't going to turn around and position itself like a spaceship coming up and eat this lure and swallow it. They're going to hit this thing because it's fluttering through the water column like an injured fish, come in and take that bait. And that's why you'll find these hooks are generally located on the top of the lure hanging down. Exceptions are lures that are specifically designed to get bit on the drop, like a slow pitch jig or a flat fall jig. These jigs are going to flutter on their way down, and the hooks will be up in basically the action zone on the fall. So if it's a slow pitch or a flat fall style jig, you will tie to a designated area at the top. If it's a butterfly or a vertical jig, a jig that's designed to move up and down through the water column, it's going to have the hook up near the top. Couple little pointers: if you're putting your own assist hooks on, because you can tie your own, one of the things you want to make sure is that your hook is nowhere near the size profile of the jig. So you either want to be significantly smaller than the profile of the jig or much wider. I tend to err on the wider side. If the profile or the gap of your hook is about the size of the jig you're using, there's a pretty good chance it'll get hung up on the jig, or when a fish bites down on it, it could get stuck on the jig and reduce your likelihood of a good hook set. So you do want to make sure that you have a good wide hook on there. You also notice that the hooks are either between 1/3 and 2/3 of the overall length of the jig. The assist hook should never be below the length of the jig. It's going to tumble, you'll get tangles and issues that way. I like that top 1/3 personally. Another thing to point out, there's a solid ring on here and there's a split ring on here. I'll use that same terminal connection that I talked about before, where I have a barrel swivel with a solid ring, and I'll attach that to the split ring, or I'll tie directly to the solid ring. It's a bad idea in general to tie your knot directly to the split ring, because as you're fighting a fish, there's a good chance that that knot will work its way into the opening of the split ring and during the fight can actually back out. It's a risk you run. It can't happen, but it's a good idea to try and tie to a solid ring, or even just take a solid ring from a pre-made package, attach that to the split ring and tie to that. Always try to tie to something that's more secure. Again, after all the money and time you're investing in this concept of jigging in general, it's important that you're not getting cheap or getting lazy at the actual point where you're connecting with the fish. Understanding all of the gear and the lures in play, the technique overall with jigging, you found the life and you're using your sonar to locate these fish. A couple of tips for that. Once you've marked fish, you do want to try to mark them again. Don't just mark fish and start dropping. So it's a good idea that if you do find life, get over the top of the fish, mark them. Especially if you've got them on a large bait source, try to get up drift to them, come back over and mark them again. Okay, we know we've got life happening here. If you were to look at a screenshot of fish on the screen and then stick your head under the water, you'd have this massive ball of bait and life down there, and you'd have these large predators moving through and influencing the movements of those bait. And you want to be basically with your jig that one bait fish that made the mistake of getting on the outside of the school that's very erratic, or that one bait fish that's injured and falling, and when the tuna comes up to this big school of bait or whatever fish you're targeting sees this, there's the one in the group that's standing out. So as soon as you mark those fish, get back over the top of them, and as soon as you start to get back over the top of those fish, if you start marking them on the screen, you should already be dropping. So have your crew ready. By the time those fish have moved by, I see it a lot where on the screen you've got blue, a whole bunch of fish, and then blue again. And people are like, look at all the fish on the screen drop. It's like, no, they're not on the screen anymore. To understand sonar would be to understand this. If you had a fish that just went under your boat and sat there and stayed with you the whole time, it wouldn't show like an arch. It would show like a solid line, almost like an EKG and flat line under your boat. So the most active part of your sonar is that screen coming on the top. That's why old school guys ice fishing still use flashers. They know live when it's happening under their boat. So unless you have live feed sonar, if you've got a traditional sonar, it's right when those marks first start to show up on that left-hand input, that incoming side of the screen, that's when you want to drop your jigs so that they're falling right into the middle of that school. I will say this, though. If you approach a school or a feed, you're not in topwater mode, and there are still birds or life engaged in that area, maybe they're looking in the water, maybe there's still some marine life around, it doesn't hurt. I know said don't go blind jigging because it'll tire you out. It doesn't hurt to drop a jig once or twice there, a Ronzi, a Hoagie, whatever you want to fish. Get it down in the water column and see if you can pick up one of those last few fish that are cleaning up that are in the area. From there, we're going to transition to easily the most exciting part of Jig and Pop. We're going to talk about casting to big game fish, or popping and stick baiting. So the pop, and pop really isn't just popping, especially here in the Northeast. A lot of times it's stick baiting as well. So Throwing large lures on the surface to big game fish, run and gun, a lot of different nicknames for it. It's the most exciting part of the sport. It can be the most frustrating part of the sport because they can get very keyed in on smaller baits. And these aren't just bluefish. You can't run into most big game species of fish and just throw a lure into the middle of them and expect them to just crush your bait right away. I try to make an analogy. If a rabbit ran at a lion, it's a pretty good chance the lion's not just going to go, cool, rabbit's running at me, I'm going to eat it. They're going to be like, why is the prey running at me? They're going to back off. So think about your approach to whenever you're targeting these fish. It's most important that when you present to any kind of fish feeding on the surface that you land your lure in a position that it's going to run away from them and land up current from them or up direction of whatever they happen to be pushing or feeding. And this comes down to boat handling. And I'll spend a minute here on this because New England has some of the best jigging and popping guides on the planet. You find some really good ones down in the tropics as well, but here in the Northeast, it's a bread and butter, and there's some of the best in the world are right up here in the Northeast. And they're out here doing it, and some of us are out here doing it recreationally. Some people are doing it for fun. Some people are doing it for a tournament. Whatever your reason behind doing it, we all have our own. Boat handling is as important about approaching the fish, but also interacting with other boaters. I can tell you right now, if there were all 20 guys on the water, women, men, targeting these fish on the surface, and everybody understood the concept of how to approach a school of fish, how to present to them, there wouldn't be people running over the top of them. One of the best things you can do is allow these fish to build. You want to see the life building. Maybe there's 2 or 3 other boats in the area. Kind of make eye contact with each other. Don't just be like, I'm going to get to those fish before them, because you're just going to create this really hostile scenario, and it's going to shut down your day of fishing, I can guarantee it, or end up with an interesting meeting in the parking lot later. It's a good idea to be cerebral about the entire process. So again, I said, get up ahead of these fish, present to them so that it's running. If there's 3 boats there, right, you want to get on opposite sides of these fish while they're pushing, and understand that chances are they're just going to be chasing bait. If you get over in front of them, you might get your presentation to them. They're probably just going to go underneath you and come right back up, or they'll bank off. But generally, they're pushing in one direction for a reason. So if you do have another boat, don't run over the top of these fish. Try to get up ahead of them. Let them come to you. Present your lure to them. Do it on the fringe. Do it on the edge. If there's another boat, have them do it from the opposite side. You can actually work together and corral them. And there's no reason why you guys can't pick off fish from the outer edges of this school by diagonally presenting to the front of them, having your bait run away. Then if one of you said, it's all mine, and you just put on Ride of the Valkyries and crash into the center of them. It's the worst thing you can possibly do. So handling yourself around other boats is just as important as handling your boat and presenting to these fish. Now you got to choose between topwater, popper, or stick bait. Again, I talked about matching the hatch. If they're on a bait like a half beak, which is a condensed New England version of a ballyhoo, or maybe they're on large mackerel, or maybe they're on herring, but they're up near the surface, they're going to be feeding on these bigger stick baits. They're going to hit lures that have flash boosts like Shimano pencils. They're going to hit custom lures like strategic anglers. They're going to hit walkers. They're going to hit a lot of different baits, sliding baits, baits that you're basically going to slash through the water column. It's going to have a little bit of movement to it, or a bait like a basic tight stick baits like an orca, Shimano orca, but I like to fish it with the rod tip very high, a very quick cadence to the rod tip, and I'm taking up as much line as I can so that I have just enough shock load in the line to allow that lure to walk. And one of the reasons for that is a bait like a half beak, before it launches, is usually it's got its tail going up on the surface of the water really easy. And same thing with flying fish, they kind of get their tail going and then they go. So having a bait slashing on the surface and being up in front of these fish works very effectively. If they're not really breaking water or throwing white water, that's when you want to use a lipless bait. A bait that when you cast it, it might have a little bit of flutter on the sink. You want to reel and come tight to it and sweep the rod. Reel and come tight to it, sweep the rod. Those types of lures are going to have a lot of movement in the water column that could produce a strike. As you get further offshore and you start getting into species like yellowfin tuna or big-eye tuna, this is the world where boats are driving around with big bars full of squid and big commotion on the surface and loud diesel engines, and these fish, despite that, think it's food. They're used to following commercial vessels, and they come rocketing up there, and it looks like people are dragging like a circus act behind the boat, and they just start crushing it. That's a great scenario for you to be able to produce fish on a popper. A loud commotioning type lure placed very effectively because you're jigging and casting it. You're not limited by the maneuverability of the boat that has to sweep around the school to get the spread in there. You can just position yourself up ahead, Ideally not in front of the guy who is trying to trolling if he's over him, of course. Again, boat handling is key. Respect us out on the water here, especially if you're getting the jigging and popping. It means you're a technical angler. You should be carrying yourself that way appropriately on the wheel and with your tackle. But get up ahead of that school, present the popper to them, real tight, big long sweep. And the yellowfin here in the Northeast and big eye are fools for it. There's a lot of static gear out there, from small commercial pots to large research buoys. You may get really lucky and find a log or some kind of commercial freezer or something floating out there. Some of the best days of my life fishing were just on a stupid tree we found here off Rhode Island, and every cast turned into a yellowfin tuna or a mahi, or we got lucky and a wahoo came up and hit an iron on the surface for us. So popping casting in general is about handling, being an effective casting angler, knowing where you are in the boat, and how you handle the boat in general, not only around the fish but also the other boats. Diving a little bit more into tackle when it comes to popping or casting to big game fish for the jig and pop world. You generally want a rod that's at least 7.6 to 8 feet, maybe even as much as 9. If it is a 2-piece rod, it's best not to have a rod that would ferrule mid-rod. For a rod, I'm going to use a Shimano Oshia Full Throttle, or I'm going to use the Grappler Series casting rods. They work very effectively. High Power X, Spiral X technology, so they're very lightweight. You got a lot of control over what you're doing, and you don't have to worry about that catastrophic rod failure when you're putting the pressure on the fish. Generally, that rod is going to be between 7.5 and 8 feet. That's my most popular sizes. On the longer side, you can go to 9. I really won't go over 8.6. It just becomes too much fighting the fish, especially with the heavier power rods I like to use. I'm typically fishing about 80 pounds of braid. I'm using a Stella 18,000 SW. The reason I choose the 18,000 over the 20 is it's a little bit faster gear ratio on it, so I can compensate for that line quickly when I'm working a plug and keeping the action. And the spool's a little smaller, just tiny little bit of weight difference. It makes it a little bit lighter. Again, you don't want to be fighting your gear. You want to fight the fish effectively. You want something lightweight, very capable of handling the fish, but also very effective at presenting lures without having to tire your body out. My drag setting on this, I'll typically have starting at about 16 to 18 pounds of drag. I don't want to lock it down and dirty right away, because you're going to hook these fish on the surface. They get real head shaky, and then they make these powerful runs. Let them make a decent run, and then as you start to get over the top of these fish, you can start increasing your drag within the comfortable scope of what you're capable of doing. A couple tricks for topwater also. You want your leader system in front of your reel. So I won't make a wind-on leader, or even if I purchased a wind-on leader like this one here, which would be AFCO's, it's a topwater leader, I'll actually trim it back depending on what rod I'm using. So I'll do my loop-to-loop connection to get it on there, or whether you're tying an FG or a PR, you want to have that knot just slightly in front of the reel. I don't like having the leader system coiled tight around the reel, because then when you go to make a cast, it's like a slinky coming off. Good chance you're going to get a wind knot. Now, any popping rod in general should have the guides on the rod flipped on that first guide. It wasn't an accident in the factory. This guide is on backwards because as these huge loops are coming off this reel with a ton of force, with a 4-ounce plug or more, you're running and gunning. It's a very aggressive action. This produces a tighter barrel for that to go through without having these big legs sticking out for that loop to catch on. So most good casting or popping rods will have a reverse stripper guide for that first guide. In some cases, the first two, you'll notice, are reversed, just to reduce that likelihood of wind knots, and then they continue with a standardized guide train as they go forward. But I will have my leader system with my knot connected just about 2 to 3 inches in front of that reel, so that when I go to cast, my fingers on that, I don't have that recoil of the memory with the fluorocarbon or mono coming off my rod, and basically creating a chance or a likelihood of a wind knot. And then what basically will have it not, it's not a length. People say, how long of a leader will I cut it? You want that system about 2 to 3 inches in front of your reel and wherever you would be casting. So wherever that lure is position-wise that's comfortable casting for you, that's where you cut it off and you attach your swivel with your solid ring, or your swivel to your split ring connection for quick interchangeability. Again, I talked about it getting frustrating when you're casting to fish, and maybe that's because there's a lot of tide. One thing you will notice is that around the slack tides, if you're targeting tuna with jig and pop, the slack tides, a lot of the life comes up, and that's when most people catch tuna, because all that life came up to the surface. It's very visual. You're not getting them on the jig as much, you're getting them more with the topwater casting. If they're on a small bait pattern, a lot of anglers get very frustrated and change their lures out a lot. You know, I made 2-3 casts into that school, they never ate it. You know, they don't want this lure. If you're using a lure that maybe you fished with one of the local captains, or maybe it's just an iconically known lure, I believe that if you believe in it and yourself, and you understand that when these fish come up and they feed on the surface, they're usually pretty committed to where they're heading. So they need to see it ahead of time, they got to be going for it. If you just threw a lure in there and 6 fish happen to be coming up in different directions that made this cool splash in front of you, but they didn't eat your bait, it's because they're not going to change their mind about what they've already committed to eat and like turn 90 degrees back and eat your plug. I believe more in keep casting. Get up ahead of them, fire your cast out again. Get up ahead of them, fire your cast out again. It's more about landing in front of that right fish and running away. If you do have to change your lure system out, I'll get into here how you can take a pair of split ring pliers, and by using that little terminal system on there, how you can change your plugs out very efficiently without having to cut your line, and it's a much quicker connection so you're still in the action while it's happening. One of the systems I mentioned was our terminal system. At the end of our leader, whether it be fluorocarbon, monofilament, whatever you're using, we have this barrel swivel to a split ring. And there's a number of different advantages to that. Again, I said if you're fishing braided line and some of these fish are taking heavy runs, casting all day, you're going to be blowing your hands up. Cuts with line, blisters, all sorts of fun stuff. So a lot of anglers will use a decent pair of gloves like these AFCO Reliefs gloves. One of the nice things about them is you've got the option on them so you can operate your phone still. If you're going to take a quick picture, you know, something comes up you want to get a shot of, or maybe you're sending a text to a buddy letting them know something's going on. But with a decent pair of split ring pliers, you can do this without having to take the gloves off. So you'll notice whenever you look, you know, you grab your plug, you get your front of your plug. Again, this also makes it nice for grabbing lures as well without getting hung up. You can grab this off your rod, and the knock on the split ring pliers will open your split ring, so that you're not having to manipulate something like a snap swivel or anything like that. You open up your end of your split ring using your split ring pliers, advance that onto the plug, and you're connected. Very important thing to understand. It's very important that you buy a swivel, like this happens to be a Croc size 3 195, that your split ring can move very freely through the swivel. You don't want a larger split ring than the opening on your swivel, because what will happen is you can get caught up in them and they can open. So you need that ability to slide through there very freely. Another really great advantage of this is traditionally you'll find anglers will hang a hook back here behind a guide, or they'll hang their hook over here on their reel. When you're spending the kind of money you're spending on a reel like the Stella, you don't really want to be beating up the rubber on your grip. You don't want this hook hitting this handle and chafing it up. You most certainly don't want the hook swinging against your lure either. I mean, swinging against your reel or swinging against your spool and damaging it, or banging up your guides on your rod. A cool way to get around that is to always have a few basic, you can have heavy duty black or just basic office rigging rubber bands like these. And what you do with them is put tension on your lure by attaching the rubber band to the treble hooks, and you can either go around the handle of your reel and back onto the plug. One of the reasons I like this is it allows me to run and gun to where the fish are. I'm not going to have to worry about this making contact with my reel or my line. It's still keeping it secure from blowing around in the wind, but it's also reducing the tension at the rod tip where your leader is connected. So you won't get this kink in your leader system that you normally might if you just reeled it tight with your rod tip to the reel itself. Also reduces a lot of wear and tear right at the tip of your rod. Another cool thing about it is whether you're just heading out for the day, you're not sure what lure you're going to fish, or maybe you're not ready to fish yet, or you're heading in at the end of the day and you don't want plugs dangling everywhere, is you can take the same idea without the lure on it. Get your rubber band. You know, I'll have, if you see me on the water, I usually have like 6, 7 of them on my wrist at any given moment. You can use your split ring pliers, get that off there, like so. Again, this is nice if it's cold. Gloves are protecting your hands from a lot of damage. So I'll show you here, because you want to make sure that that split ring and the swivel are past each other if you're going to open it. So if you grab the split ring here, you're going to end up taking your split ring off of your swivel and your lure. you want to have this on the back side of your pliers when you go to open. That's a good habit to have. Always have your swivel behind your split ring pliers so that when you go to advance this through the plug, you're not taking it off your swivel. And now you can use your rubber band in the eye of your split ring. Go back through the rubber band itself and have that same concept that you did with the lure on the handle of the rod. You can have your leader pre-tied on ahead of time, and this gives you something that you can wind down to without putting too much pressure on your rod tip, kinking your leader system, and it still has you giving you that quick interchangeability at the end of your line. Fish piles on for you, now you're tight. When you're tight, the best thing to do is just relax. Your adrenaline is going to be surging through your veins, and one of the worst things I see people do is just lock down, get tunnel vision on the fish and cranking, and all they can think about is, oh my gosh, I want this fish to the boat as fast as possible. No, okay? You want to hook the fish. As soon as you hook up, get 1 or 2 quick hook sets. If the fish is running, do not set the hook. You're going to shock load the line beyond what your tackle is going to be capable of handling. In most cases, these fish are well over the pound test of the line you're using. So when you get tight, set your hook on them, let them run. When they're running, you want to let them take the drag that you have set. You don't have to crank down on the drag right away like you're fighting some fish in a canal. Chances are you're in open water. There's no reason to overdo it on the drag. While that fish is running, compose yourself, understand where you are, get yourself in a boat position where both the person on the wheel can see where you are, where the line is, where the fish is, and communicate effectively without losing it between one another. As the fish gets closer, you're going to end up and down on the fish. It's not about rushing, or it's not about big powerful lifts with strong reels down. It's more a game of inches. When you have any kind of big fish on, maybe you're fighting a big rooster fish in Panama and he's sideways on you, or maybe you're fighting a yellowfin tuna out here in the canyons. While that fish is on its side and it's pulsing, all it has to do is get its head down a little bit, and then the kick of its tail is going to take a significant amount of line out. It's usually not as much line as it sounds on the reel. It's exciting, it sounds bad, but it's usually not that bad. That's another advantage I have with the metered braid eye fish. I can tell exactly how much line they just took. And I try to play this tug of war with the colors on them. What you want to do is keep that fish's head oriented upwards. So if you can keep shorter lifts with fast turns on the handle, you're going to be able to keep that fish's head coming up as it's spinning. Another thing you'll notice when you're fighting any kind of big game fish, and I don't care if you've got a giant tuna on a 130, swordfish on a deep drop setup, or you've got bluefin off the south here, off Rhode Island, off Block Island, and it's in a spiral on you. Generally, as the fish comes out from under the boat until it gets to the end of half that turn, you've got time to take line. Once it gets under the boat with its spin, all you can do is hope to hold tight and let it keep it there, but you're not going to gain ground. You're simply not going to gain ground while it's on the underspin of the boat. So if you start getting a little bit more mental with your process fighting the fish, I'm going to keep the head up. I'm going to try to stop them from taking line on the underswing. I'm going to try to put a little bit more pressure on them on the outward swing. That's how you're going to be able to beat these fish. It's a game of inches. And keep in mind, a reel like a Stella, you're taking over 40 inches of line in many cases with just one rotation of the handle. You're getting a significant amount of line. And, even at like 30-something inches, you're getting almost 3 feet of line for every rotation of the handle. So if on each outspin you get one full rotation of the handle, keep pressure on them under the boat. I don't care what you're fishing for, whether you're in Panama, Costa Rica, or right here off New England. That's how you're going to be able to subdue these fish. Keep the pressure on them with the rod. Don't low stick them while you're fighting them. Put as much of a high stick on it as you can if you have the appropriate gear. And it's that slower game of inches, keeping the head coming up, that's going to allow you to beat those fish. Jigging and popping is this rapidly evolving sport. It still can't even be encompassed in one package because every day it seems to evolve. Every time somebody new gets into the sport, they add a little twist to it. A new knot comes out, some new technique comes out, a new lure. It's always evolving. It's a very exciting fringe that's pushing sport fishing in general. Every time there's some kind of change to the technology with the jigging and popping, it has a huge influence on a lot of the other offshore styles of fishing. My personal advice to you, if you really want to learn jigging and popping, is to go online or hit up the guys here at the Saltwater Edge, and they can connect you to some of the best sport fishing guides on the planet that are based right here in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And that's where you're going to get that hands-on experience. And once you've taken that hands-on experience, it's going to help you decide what kind of gear you want to buy. It's going to say, all right, I like jigging a lot more than popping. It just gives you a huge head start over just purchasing a lot of gear and then charging your boat into the fleet. Educate yourself, get the right kind of setup, and it's going to be a lot more rewarding experience for you. If you have any other questions, you can hop in here at the Saltwater Edge or drop a question down in the box below. We'd be happy to answer it for you.